"Get off my land." That's what she screamed at me, standing on my porch like I was some trespasser who'd wandered too far. Clipboard in one hand like it was a weapon, violation notice in the other. For a second, I thought it had to be a joke. Some weird welcome committee prank. But no, her face was red, jaw tight, eyes locked on me like I'd broken into her personal castle. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't kidding. This woman was dead serious, claiming the property my dad built with his own hands somehow belonged to her. I swear in that moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or to get angry. Have you ever had that strange pause where your brain can't decide how to react? That's exactly where I was, standing there with dust still on my boots from unloading the truck, boxes piled by the porch, and this woman waving papers like she ran the whole lake. Moving back into my family's old cabin wasn't supposed to be complicated. It was supposed to feel like coming home. The cabin sat 50 feet from the water line, facing the cove where Dad used to fish every single morning. I'd inherited it 6 months ago, but work had kept me stuck in the city until now. I remember stepping onto those weathered porch boards, hearing them creak under my weight and feeling peace. A quiet morning, birds in the pines, the faint lap of water against the dock. The kind of peace you forget exists when you've been living too long in traffic and office chatter. I set down the first box, inhaled that familiar mix of pine sap and lake moisture, and felt like I was back in my childhood again. Dad's old toolbox was still there on the steps, untouched, rust stains on the handle. Inside were his property markers, the very ones he'd used when neighbors respected boundaries instead of arguing over them. The anchor ring on the dock, weathered since the 60s, was still solid. It was all here, our history, our home. And then footsteps. Heavy ones, fast, not the sound of a neighbor coming over to say welcome back, but something sharper. The kind of walk that carries a message before a word is spoken. "Excuse me." Her voice cut through the morning air like a saw blade. I turned to see her. Mid-40s, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, dressed in what I can only describe as an aggressive jogging outfit. Clipboard clutched in one hand, a notice in the other. "You need to get off my land immediately. This is community lakefront property under HOA management. You're in direct violation of our standards." She shoved the paper toward me. Some HOA violation slip with a $75 fine scribbled at the bottom like it was a parking ticket. I blinked, then blinked again. My family had owned this cabin for more than 40 years. We weren't just outside her HOA, we'd been here before her HOA ever existed. But here she was on my porch telling me I was violating her community standards. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "this is my family's cabin. Has been since before you moved here. I think there's some confusion." She tilted her head, smirked, and said it again. "No, no confusion. All lakefront property visible from the community falls under HOA jurisdiction. That includes this structure." The word structure rolled off her tongue like she was describing garbage. I almost laughed. Visible from the community? By that logic, she owned half the county. I showed her my utility letter, clear proof the property was outside their jurisdiction. She barely glanced before waving it off. "Administrative oversight," she said. "We're working to correct those boundary issues with the county." And that's when I realized what I was dealing with. This wasn't about aesthetics. This wasn't about community standards. This was about control. The wind chime across the cove clanged in the breeze, the sound carrying like an eerie soundtrack to our standoff. I looked at my father's anchor ring on the dock, solid as the day he bolted it there. It had been here long before her clipboard, her polo shirt board, her made-up rules. And still, she stood tall, waiting for me to fold. I pulled out my phone and started recording, because who in their right mind would believe this conversation otherwise? "So," I said slowly, holding up the phone, "you're saying you own the water in front of my dock?" She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her voice, and declared, "The HOA has environmental oversight responsibilities. That extends to all waterfront properties affecting community aesthetics. Policy made up in real time, and spoken with the kind of confidence that could convince someone who didn't know better." That was the moment I realized this woman wasn't used to people saying no. And something deep in my gut told me this was only the beginning. 3 days later, I woke up to something I never expected to see on my shoreline. A bright yellow plastic barrier stretched across the lake in front of my dock. Not beside it, not near it. Directly across it, anchored to my father's steel ring like they'd owned the thing all along. I stepped out onto the porch in my pajamas, coffee mug in hand, squinting into the morning sun like maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. A heavy-duty silt curtain, the kind contractors use during construction projects. Except there was no construction happening anywhere near the lake. Just this wall of plastic cutting me off from my own water. I walked down to the dock, bare feet on the damp boards, coffee cooling in my hand. There was even a placard zip-tied to the barrier, Temporary Environmental Protection Measure. HOA Authorization HV 2407. The audacity nearly knocked the breath out of me. This wasn't an accident. They had trespassed onto my property, bolted their equipment to my anchor ring, and cut me off from the water my family had fished and swum in for decades. And they hadn't even bothered with a phone call. I could almost hear my dad's voice in that moment. Sometimes, son, you've got to clear your own path. The thought pulled me toward his old toolbox again, rust on the latch, dust on the lid. Inside, beneath the fishing tackle and rolled-up surveys, I found them. His bolt cutters. Heavy, worn handles with a grip that still felt strong in my hands. I didn't hesitate. I marched straight to that anchor point, clamped the cutters around the steel cable, and squeezed with everything I had. Ping! The snap echoed across the cove like a gunshot. The barrier sagged immediately, the lake's current pulling it downstream. I stood there, coffee forgotten, watching bright yellow plastic drift away like some ridiculous parade float. And for the first time since moving back, I felt proud. Not scared, not cornered, proud. That's when I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel behind me. Fast, sharp, familiar. "What do you think you're doing?" Rebecca's voice cracked across the morning air, but this time there was panic under the authority. She wasn't alone either. 2 people trailed her, neighbors, board members maybe, faces tight, arms crossed, standing like backup muscle. I turned slowly, bolt cutters still in hand. Calm, steady. "I'm removing trespassing equipment from my property," I said, and the surprising thing was I meant it without a shred of doubt. Rebecca's face cycled through 3 shades of red before she found her words. "You just destroyed community environmental protection equipment. That barrier was preventing erosion runoff from contaminating our water supply." Her words came fast, sharp, confident, but even as she said it, the position of the barrier betrayed her. Anyone who'd ever managed a shoreline could see it wasn't protecting from runoff. It was blocking access, plain and simple. The 2 board members nodded anyway, like trained seals. Then her voice shifted, softer, almost sweet. She reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook. "I'll give you $200 if you'll move that anchor ring just 5 feet closer to shore," she said, flipping it open right there on my dock. "Everyone wins. We get clear water monitoring, you get compensated, and we can be good neighbors." She was serious, a bribe out in the open. I set the bolt cutters down on the dock, letting the sound ring out sharp and heavy. "This is my anchor ring on my property. I don't need your permission and I don't need your money." For the first time, she blinked, lost her footing, but only for a second. "Fine," the checkbook snapped shut. "But you should know that anchor ring services our community's fire safety water access. By blocking it, you're endangering lives." Another lie, said loud enough for her board members to hear, said with total confidence. I pointed toward the bright orange no trespassing sign nailed to the HOA dock across the cove. "Funny," I said. "Seems like your community's pretty selective about access when it suits you." Her jaw clenched, she didn't answer. Instead, she watched in silence as her expensive environmental protection drifted further downstream, plastic sagging, cables dragging, bright yellow against the water like a spotlight on her failure. Finally, she muttered, quiet, almost to herself, "This won't end here." The 2 board members shifted uneasily, their faith cracking just a little as they followed her back toward the subdivision. I stood on that dock long after they were gone, the cutters still at my feet, the lake calm again. For the first time since I'd moved back, I felt my dad's presence not just in memory, but in action. He'd always said the simplest solution is usually the right one. Don't overthink. Don't wait for permission. Just clear your own path. But that pride didn't last long. That night it started. Not vandalism, not broken glass, nothing the sheriff could come out and write a report on. No, it was quieter, more subtle, more sinister. Drones. Small, buzzing surveillance drones, hovering just outside my bedroom window. The first night I thought maybe it was some security upgrade gone wrong, a coincidence, but by the third night I knew. Every night, 11 p.m. sharp, red dots blinking like sniper sights, hovering, watching, waiting. And the worst part? They always pulled back the moment I stepped outside, then returned as soon as I went back in. Precise, calculated, like someone was operating them from across the water with a headset and a stopwatch. It wasn't random, it wasn't coincidence. It was harassment. And as I lay awake staring at those blinking red eyes through the glass, grinding my teeth until my jaw ached, one thought burned in my head. If Rebecca was willing to trespass, lie, bribe, and now use drones to wear me down, how far was she really going to take this? They started showing up every night at 11, little buzzing shadows, red dots like tiny suns, watching my bedroom like vultures circling a carcass. Sleep turned into a battleground. Every creak of the cabin sounded like a warning. Every car door across the cove made my heart jump. I tried earplugs, thick curtains, even a sleeping pill once. Nothing stopped that mechanical hum, that insulting precision. The drone pattern was the worst part. Rotate, hover, scan, fade when I stepped outside, return when I retreated. Someone was timing me. Someone was learning my rhythms and using them as a weapon. Third night, I gave up pretending fear didn't make my hands shake. I crawled out of bed, wrapped a hoodie around me, and went downstairs. The porch light painted the steps a tired yellow. The pine-scented air was cold enough to bite. The lake slept like glass, untroubled, while machinery kept watch over my life. I felt ridiculous and furious all at once. There's a specific kind of anger that comes from being watched in your most private hours. It makes you small, but it also makes you want to act. Dad's toolbox had become a shrine of sorts. I sat on the porch with the lid open, looking at the bolt cutters, the old surveys, the coiled wires. My hands remembered the feel of tools before my mind did. Building had always calmed me, so I built. Not a barricade, exactly, something smarter. A rig, a makeshift camera tower to stream whatever hovered outside my windows. I scavenged lumber from the shed, a dead phone with decent video, a phone mount, and some batteries. I dug out extension cords, ran them through weatherproof tubing, and anchored everything against the wind. The work was methodical. Measure, cut, screw, adjust. It was comfort that smelled of sawdust and old rope. Neighbors probably heard the hammering. I hope they did. Putting the pieces together made me feel less like a target and more like someone reclaiming an ordinary life. By dusk, the tower stood 8 feet tall at the edge of the porch, angled to catch anything that came near my bedroom. It wasn't pretty, but it pointed a camera straight across the water and streamed to a public link. I set the stream to auto-record. For the first night in a week, I slept without waking to phantom lights cutting across my ceiling. When the drones came, they entered a new world, one with witnesses. The red dots blinked, adjusted, and then curiosity. They hovered within view of a dozen strangers' phones. I woke to messages. At first, it was a neighbor asking if I was okay. Then a retired engineer I'd never met sent a quick note. "You got footage?" The live chat filled with clacks of keyboards and sympathetic emojis. People began tuning in not for drama, but because the thing everyone inside the stream window wanted to see was proof. Proof that what had felt like a private nightmare was a public disturbance. 2 days later, a woman I'd only waved to twice showed up at my dock with a thermos and a stack of printed meeting minutes. "You think you're alone," she said, sitting in an empty lawn chair as if she'd been invited. "You're not." It felt surreal, recruiting allies not through a town hall, but by hand tools and a webcam. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down typed in the chat while she sat on her steps. "Those lights kept my grandkids awake all summer. I didn't know why." Mr. Garcia started taking pictures of the HOA lights, zooming in on angles that made them look less like safety and more like targeting. A retired schoolteacher uploaded an old ledger showing unapproved expenditures. The community on the stream was patchwork. Fishermen, retired engineers, stay-at-home parents with kids on their laps, all watching the same recording and nodding together. But the attention had another effect. It pulled Rebecca out of the murky corners and into the light she'd always wanted. She came over the next morning with the full board trailing behind her like a band of hired actors, matching polos, tablets, and that practiced, righteous stride. She pointed at my rig and announced to anyone within earshot, "You're broadcasting an unauthorized surveillance feed that endangers everyone around this lake." She used the word danger like a talisman. The board murmured as if the talisman had weight. It would have been easy to boil with anger, to shout and fling terms like harassment or trespass into the air and hope something landed. Instead, I kept my voice low and slow. Low works with witnesses. Slow makes your words feel like they've been thought through. I explained calmly what had happened with the barrier, the placards, and the bolt cutters. I showed the stream footage, drone after drone, rotating like tiny moons, ghosts of red light floating in the frame. People leaned forward on their lawns and in their cars to watch. The board's posture shifted, Rebecca's smirk tightened. Then Mrs. Henderson spoke up, not online this time, but from her folding chair on the edge of the neighbor's lawn. "Rebecca, those lights have been keeping my grandkids awake when they visit," she said, slow and certain. "If they're for safety, why only shine on Luke's place?" Her voice drifted across the water in a way that made the truth feel like sunlight. The question landed like a pebble that found its way to the bottom of a murky pool. Rebecca's argument, all theatrical and confident, needed more than a pebble to survive. A few more neighbors joined the circle, people I'd passed with a nod for years. They carried evidence, photographs, notes, a ledger. It turned out Rebecca had a habit of starting emergency projects and funding them without the full membership's consent. Her pattern was consistent. Identify a problem, rush a solution, and frame anybody who questioned her as an obstacle to safety. The live stream chat filled with confirmations. The retired engineer posted angle analyses. A woman on the far side of the cove uploaded a video of the lighting that made it obvious. The beams were focused, not general. The murmurs grew into an organized murmur. That afternoon, Mr. Garcia sidled up to me while Rebecca gathered her people. He lowered his voice like a man sharing contraband coffee. "Been watching your stream," he said, uncertain pride in his tone. "You got more folks looking than she expected." The admission felt like a small victory. Everyone loves the underdog who can wield tools and truth. But the relief was tempered by a bruise I didn't expect. Hank, Dad's old friend, the man who'd helped build half the dock, the one who'd promised to look after things, he started to pull away. He came over one morning with a coffee in hand and a face that looked tired in a way I'd never seen. He didn't accuse me outright. He didn't need to. He asked questions that sounded reasonable. "Have you checked the county regs on emergency water access? We don't want to be on the hook if someone needs help." His tone suggested he was worried about me getting in over my head. The implication stung deeper than any direct insult. If Hank, who knew the anchor ring bolts like his own name, could be nudged by fear into doubt, then Rebecca's game was working on more than policy. She was winning hearts and bending friendships. Still, the tide was changing. The live stream had turned private torment into public record, and once people saw the pattern, they began to look for answers. That's what scares a control freak, being seen. In the face of attention, the fancy words wobble, the supposed emergencies look manufactured, and the confidence thins. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, not because the drones stopped, but because I'd stopped being the only witness. There's a strange kind of courage that comes from knowing you're not alone. It doesn't roar, it steadies. It made me start planning not a fight, but a story, how to show the entire lake what had been done in our name and how to do it in a way that everyone could understand. The rig on the porch hummed quietly, recording. My hands smelled of sawdust. The lake outside, for the first time in a long stretch, felt like it might belong to all of us again. By Monday morning, I thought things had finally settled. The drones had backed off a little after the live stream gained traction. Neighbors were starting to whisper in my direction instead of away from it. For the first time since I'd moved back, I could sip my coffee on the porch and almost believe peace was possible. Then Hank showed up. He walked up the steps like he'd done 100 times when Dad was alive, carrying his usual thermos, moving slow. But something about him was different. He avoided eye contact, like a man who owed you money or carried bad news. He settled into Dad's old chair, the one that still creaked when you leaned back, and cleared his throat. "Luke," he said, not looking at me, "we need to talk about this situation with Rebecca." My stomach dropped. He never called her Rebecca before. It was always that woman or the bored lady. The fact that he used her first name told me before he even finished his sentence. She'd gotten to him. Hank was the man who had helped Dad pour the concrete footings for this porch. The man who'd stood beside me at the funeral and said, "I'll keep an eye on things here for you, son." And now, here he was, sipping coffee in Dad's chair, repeating HOA talking points. "Some folks in the neighborhood are concerned about the escalation," he said carefully, like the word escalation had been handed to him in a script. Escalation, as if I'd been the one trespassing with plastic barriers, as if I'd been the one sending drones to hover at bedroom windows. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, my voice already sharp. Hank shifted, eyes darting toward the cove where the subdivision sat like a fortress. "Rebecca showed me some documentation from the county about water access, fire safety. She says that Anchor Ring might be part of their emergency planning. If that's true, Luke," his voice trailed off. I set my mug down harder than I meant to, coffee splashing onto the boards. "Hank, you helped Dad bolt that ring into place. You know it predates their subdivision by decades." But I could see it, the doubt flickering in his eyes. The seed Rebecca had planted was sprouting, and Hank, of all people, was starting to believe it. "She's not right about everything," he admitted, "but she's not wrong about all of it either. They do maintain the lake, you know, water testing, safety drills. Maybe there's room for compromise." Compromise, another word straight from her playbook. And there it was, the betrayal I hadn't expected. Not from Hank, not from the man who'd been closer to my father than anyone. I sat there staring at him, feeling like I'd just lost Dad all over again. Rebecca wasn't just trying to control my property. She was isolating me, turning allies into skeptics, making me look like the unreasonable neighbor, the stubborn holdout. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "What if I'm wrong, Hank? What if I've been fighting her when the county actually does have regulations I don't know about?" Saying it out loud was like handing her the victory. I hated how weak it sounded, but Hank leaned forward, softer now, almost fatherly. "Call the fire marshal. Ask. If you're right, then you'll have proof. But if you're wrong, better to know now before this gets out of hand." After he left, the silence in the cabin felt heavier than ever. I stared out at the lake, mist rising like nothing had changed, when in reality everything had. I wasn't just fighting Rebecca anymore. I was fighting doubt. My father's best friend, the man who knew the history better than anyone, now thought maybe I was the problem. That night I barely slept. The drones came back, blinking their red lights like clockwork, but it wasn't the buzzing that kept me awake. It was Hank's words, "What if you're wrong?" By Tuesday morning, I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. I called the county fire marshal's office, explained the situation, asked about federal fire safety requirements, and waited while the line clicked with transfers and hold music. When the official finally came back, their answer was simple and firm. There were no regulations granting the HOA authority over my dock or anchor ring. None. Relief should have flooded me, but instead suspicion did. Because if there were no official regulations, then Rebecca's confidence wasn't based on misunderstanding. It was deliberate. She was manufacturing authority from thin air. That afternoon, the package arrived. A professional-grade water testing kit. I'd ordered it online after one particularly bad night with the drones. If she wanted to play the environmental protection card, I was going to meet her head-on with data. Collecting samples was tedious but strangely grounding. 6 points around the dock, careful notes, photos, timestamps. The results came back cleaner than I'd dared hope. My property wasn't polluting anything. If anything, the water around my dock was cleaner than the HOA's side of the cove. I sat on the porch holding those results, feeling vindicated when a shadow crossed the steps. Rebecca. Again, clipboard in hand, folder under her arm, but her tone was different this time. "Luke," she said, quieter than before, "I think we need to talk about what's really happening with this lake." She laid out her own set of test results, numbers that looked suspiciously recycled, charts with inconsistencies anyone with a calculator could catch. But she spoke with practiced ease, like a politician at a town hall. She even tugged at nostalgia, telling me how she'd learned to swim in this very lake as a child. For a moment, I almost believed she cared. But then I saw it. Tucked into her folder was a notebook marked Phase 2, filled with what looked like forged signatures and doctored results. That was the moment the whole picture snapped into focus. She wasn't just faking documents. She was running a campaign, phased, deliberate, planned. Every lie, every oversight, every trespass was just one step in a bigger blueprint. I didn't say anything, didn't call her out. I nodded along, agreed to look into the septic inspection she suggested, and let her walk back toward her kingdom of manicured lawns and HOA bylaws. But inside, my mind was racing. Rebecca wasn't improvising anymore. She was executing. And whatever Phase 2 meant, it was already in motion. By Saturday, I was done letting Rebecca control the narrative. I cleared off my living room table, set up lights, dragged out a cheap mic, and spread every piece of evidence I had across the wood like it was a courtroom bench. Property surveys, photos of the barrier, screenshots of the drones, water test results, timestamps, everything. If she wanted to play politics, I'd play truth. I hit go live. At first, I thought maybe no one would care. Who would tune in to hear a guy rant about HOA harassment on a Saturday morning? But the comments started rolling in before I even finished my introduction. The first came from an elderly woman I barely knew. "I've been keeping records of HOA meetings since Rebecca took over. Some of us have concerns." She posted scanned pages of meeting minutes and financial reports. My jaw nearly dropped. Buried in those files were 17 emergency projects Rebecca had pushed through without proper votes. The drones, listed as security infrastructure upgrades. The barrier, filed under lake protection initiatives. Thousands of dollars, all authorized by her alone. Minutes later, a retired engineer joined the chat. He uploaded photographs of the light array positioned across the cove. Each beam's angle documented, each timing sequence logged. His message was short, almost clinical. "This lighting system doesn't make sense for security. It makes perfect sense for targeted harassment." By noon, the stream had turned into a digital town square. 8 neighbors on camera, more in the comments. Stories spilled out like water over a broken dam. One woman across the lake said Rebecca had once tried to fine her for painting her dock the wrong color, even though her property wasn't in the HOA. Another neighbor revealed Rebecca had filed a false county complaint about their mailbox color, claiming it was a navigation hazard. But the most damning moment came when a quiet man I'd only nodded at in passing spoke up. "I'm on the board. Half the time, we don't even know about these projects until after she installs them. She calls emergency meetings, rushes approvals, says it's for safety. We don't get to ask questions." It hit me then, this wasn't just about my cabin. It was about control. About how one person had twisted an entire community into following her lead through fear and urgency. "What if we organized a live community stream?" I suggested, adrenaline making my voice shake just a little. Not to attack Rebecca, not to start fights, just to show facts, to talk openly about property rights, environmental protection, and proper procedures. The response was instant. People nodded. Comments flew in. They were tired of whispers. They wanted sunlight. By Sunday night, 43 people had confirmed for a Tuesday evening broadcast. Not just neighbors, board members, families, even a few people from across town who'd heard the stories. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like maybe Rebecca wasn't the only one who knew how to rally a crowd. But Monday morning brought a gut punch. The board member who'd spoken up called me before I'd even finished my coffee. His voice was tight, rushed. "Luke, you need to know Rebecca called an emergency meeting for tonight. She's framing tomorrow's community stream as opposition to environmental protection. She's telling people it's property rights extremism." Extremism, the word burned. In one stroke, she was painting me and everyone who'd stood up as radicals who hated the lake. And worse, she was pushing for expanded enforcement authority to deal with what she called outside agitators. I hung up the phone and stared at the lake until the mist cleared. The live stream had given us momentum, but it had also forced Rebecca to escalate. She wasn't going to let go of power quietly. She was turning it into a war of perception, twisting democracy into dictatorship in the language of safety. And yet, her desperation told me something important. We were getting through. Tuesday night came like a storm you know is going to break, but you don't know where the lightning will strike. The community center was packed, standing room only. I'd set up early, laying out property surveys, water test results, photos, recordings, every artifact of this months-long nightmare. Families I'd never met filled the chairs. Teenagers leaned against the back wall, whispering. Old-timers who'd known my dad sat up front, arms crossed, waiting. Then Rebecca walked in. Not with neighbors, not with friends, with a full entourage that looked like a law firm. 5 people in business attire carrying briefcases, spreading folders across the table like a trial was about to start. She wasn't coming to discuss. She was coming to dominate. The format was simple. I'd present first, then she'd respond, then open discussion. I started with the basics: county records, utility company letters, proof my cabin sat outside HOA jurisdiction, photos of the barrier bolted illegally to my anchor ring, videos of the drones hovering at my window. I explained calmly, carefully, that property rights and environmental protection weren't enemies. They could coexist if we respected boundaries. Rebecca's turn came next. She opened with aerial photos of the lake, all glossy and beautiful, the kind that stir nostalgia. Then she hit the crowd with 10 years of declining water quality data. Charts, graphs, warnings about the future. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who believed the role of savior had been carved out just for her. Individual property rights, she declared, cannot supersede collective responsibility. Stewardship requires authority. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made. Heads nodded, even mine for a second, because who doesn't want to protect a lake that raised their children, held their memories? But then she made her fatal mistake. She pulled out a document I'd never seen before, held it high like it was holy. This, she announced, is a federal environmental emergency declaration. It grants temporary HOA oversight of all lakefront properties until restoration is complete. The room went silent, my chest tightened. If it was real, I was finished. Property rights don't trump federal emergencies. She didn't let anyone hold it. Just waved it, read from it, let the official seals catch the light. But something in me balked. The formatting looked wrong, the font off. So I did the only thing I could. I pulled out my phone and right there in front of everyone, dialed the county environmental office. I'd like to verify a federal environmental emergency declaration for our lake, I said, reading the number from her paper. The entire room held its breath. 2 minutes of hold music. Then a voice came through the speaker, calm, professional. There is no federal environmental emergency declaration for your lake. We have no record of any intervention. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was heavy, shocking, final. Rebecca froze. Her legal team stiffened. Neighbors murmured. And in that instant, every ounce of authority she'd built crumbled like wet paper. The county official's words still echoed through the room when the silence finally broke. There is no federal environmental emergency declaration for your lake. You could have heard a pin drop. Then the murmur started, low, confused, sharp, like a crowd realizing they'd been conned in real time. Rebecca's face flushed crimson, then pale. Her fingers tightened on the paper until it crumpled. There must be some administrative delay in the county records, she stammered, but her voice had lost its steel. Everyone could hear the panic behind the words. A man from the second row stood up, one of her own board members. His voice carried across the room, steady and hard. Rebecca, did you create that document yourself, or did it come from a federal agency? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. She didn't answer, not directly. Administrative procedures are complex, she muttered. "The important thing is we have documented authority to take protective actions." But nobody was buying it anymore. The open discussion period turned into a reckoning. One by one, neighbors stood to tell their stories. The woman with the blue dock revealed how Rebecca had tried to fine her for aesthetic violations, even though she lived outside the HOA. Another admitted Rebecca had filed a false complaint with the county about his mailbox. Mr. Garcia shared his photos of the harassment lights. And then Mrs. Henderson, sweet, soft-spoken Mrs. Henderson, stood up and said plainly, "Rebecca, you've made this whole lake miserable. Those lights, those drones, the bullying, it ends tonight." The room erupted in applause. By the time the meeting ended, the verdict wasn't official, but it was clear. Rebecca's credibility was gone. Board members distanced themselves. Neighbors whispered apologies to me as they left, their eyes wide with shock. But as Rebecca gathered her papers and swept toward the door, I caught her expression. Not shame, not defeat, calculation. Even stripped bare in front of 60 people, she was still plotting her next move. 2 nights later, the emergency HOA board meeting was called. The community center was packed again, standing room, only for the second time in a week. This time, though, the energy was different. People weren't here to learn or argue. They were here to see justice. Rebecca sat alone at the front table. No entourage, no lawyers, just her and a folder she clutched like a lifeline. The board chair cleared his throat. "Tonight, we address allegations of falsified documentation, misuse of funds, and unauthorized enforcement actions." Before anyone else could speak, the doors opened. County officials walked in. 2 men, 1 woman carrying files stamped with official seals. Their presence shifted the air immediately. Rebecca's shoulders stiffened, her jaw clenched. "We've received reports of falsified federal documents and tampering with safety equipment," one of them announced, voice firm but even. "We're here to investigate." The crowd gasped. Rebecca tried one last performance, flipping open her folder. "I have a comprehensive environmental protection plan that justifies all prior actions." But without her fake federal authority, her words fell flat. The officials went one by one, dismantling her defenses. First, the money. They presented receipts she had filed, thousands spent on unapproved projects. The drones, the barrier, the lights. Each item listed under emergency initiatives that never saw a community vote. Second, authority. They confirmed what the county had told me on the phone. The HOA had no jurisdiction over non-member properties. My cabin wasn't under her control, never had been. Third, the safety equipment. They announced an official fine, $500 for tampering with emergency access, plus $250 for presenting false documentation. When the fire marshal himself handed Rebecca the citations, the crowd erupted. Applause, whistles, even a cheer from one of the teenagers at the back. Rebecca, the woman who had stood on my porch weeks ago waving papers like a queen with a scepter, now sat alone at the front table, clutching citations like they were handcuffs. Her power was gone. But what struck me most was what happened next. The crowd didn't gloat. They didn't jeer. Instead, neighbors began talking about what came next. About septic upgrades, erosion control, water quality monitoring, real solutions, handled the right way together. The board chair announced sweeping changes. Environmental oversight would transfer to a rotating committee of residents with transparent procedures. Budgets would be voted on. No more unilateral authority. Then he looked straight at me. "Luke, we'd like you to consider joining." I almost laughed. Weeks ago, I was the enemy. Now I was being asked to help lead. Walking out of that meeting, I expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt something quieter, relief. The harassment lights were already being dismantled. The drones were gone. The lake under the moonlight looked like it had before Rebecca's war began. Calm, still, mine. But as I crossed the gravel lot toward my truck, I turned back just once. Rebecca stood by the doors, folder clutched tight, eyes on me. And even stripped of her power, even fined and humiliated, her look wasn't one of surrender. It was the same calculating stare she'd worn since the first day on my porch. as if she was already planning phase 3. For the first time in months, the nights were quiet. No buzzing drones outside my windows. No floodlights cutting across the cove. Just the steady hum of crickets and the lapping of water against the dock. I should have slept like a child, but something in me couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up. Every ripple on the lake caught my eye. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. Rebecca's eyes the night she was fined had told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't done. And I was right. It started with whispers. A neighbor knocking on my door to say Rebecca had been seen at the county offices, filing inquiries. Another neighbor told me she'd been calling around town, warning businesses not to entangle themselves with me because I was under investigation. Then came the rumors that I was secretly planning to sell the cabin to developers, that I was poisoning the lake with chemicals, that I was planning to sue the entire HOA for millions. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. Lies have a way of sticking if you throw enough of them at the wall. One afternoon, Hank showed up again. His eyes looked tired, but this time he didn't avoid me. He just stood there on the porch, hat in hand, and said, "She's calling folks at church now, telling them you're trying to destroy the community." I let out a bitter laugh. What community? The one she's been tearing apart for years. But Hank didn't laugh, he just sighed. People want peace, Luke. If she convinces them you're the problem, they'll turn back to her, fines or no fines. That stung, because I knew he was right. Rebecca didn't need authority to control people, she just needed fear. So I decided to do the one thing she never expected, invite everyone to see for themselves. The next Saturday, I hosted a potluck at the cabin. Nothing fancy, just folding tables, paper plates, and whatever dishes people wanted to bring. The gravel drive was full by noon. Families came with kids chasing each other across the yard. Old-timers brought casseroles and jars of pickles. Someone dragged out a guitar. We ate under the pines, the smell of grilled chicken mixing with the lake air. Laughter carried across the water. For the first time, the cabin felt alive again, not like a bunker in a war, but like a home. Rebecca didn't show. Of course she didn't, but her absence spoke louder than her presence ever could have. Halfway through the afternoon, Mrs. Henderson stood up, paper plate in hand, and raised her voice just enough to carry. "I've lived by this lake 40 years, she said. "I've never seen this many neighbors together in one place, just enjoying each other." She looked around, eyes bright. "Maybe this is what we needed all along, not meetings, not votes, just time together." The applause was quiet, but it was real. And in that moment, I realized something important. Rebecca's power had always come from division, from keeping us in our separate houses, too scared or ashamed to talk. But once people sat side by side at a table, sharing food and stories, her spell weakened. Still, the shadows weren't gone. The next week, I found tire tracks in the gravel drive that didn't match any of my neighbors' vehicles. A dead fish left on the porch one morning. Anonymous notes in the mailbox. "Sell while you still can." I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't even tell the neighbors. Because deep down, I knew Rebecca was behind it, and I knew exposing it would only give her what she wanted, attention. Instead, I doubled down on transparency. Every water test I ran, I posted online. Every septic inspection, every property survey, I shared with the community group we'd built through the live stream. I turned every corner of my life at the cabin into daylight she couldn't twist into rumor. And slowly the tide turned. Hank started coming back around, first to help mend a fence, then to share coffee on the porch again. The board member who'd once been silent showed up with his teenage son to fish off my dock. Even the family that had been most loyal to Rebecca sent their kids over with cookies one afternoon. No explanation, just a quiet olive branch. The lake was healing, the people were healing. Rebecca, though, she retreated further into the shadows. Her fines stood, her credibility gone. The board stripped her of her unilateral powers, and though she still attended meetings, she sat silent more often than not. The queen had become just another resident. But the look she gave me, every time our eyes met across the water, said it all. She hadn't forgiven, she hadn't forgotten. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and painted the lake gold, I sat on the dock with Hank. We watched the ripples spread, quiet between us, until he finally spoke. "Your dad would have been proud, you know, not because you fought her, but because you held your ground without becoming her." I swallowed hard, staring at the reflection of the cabin in the water. The windows glowed with warm light. Neighbors' laughter drifted faintly across the cove. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady. "Maybe," I said, "but I think he'd remind me of something too." "What's that?" "That fights like this don't really end. You just learn how to live with the shadows." Hank nodded, slow and thoughtful. "Shadows don't win if you keep a light burning." And as the crickets sang and the night wrapped itself around us, I realized that's exactly what the cabin had become again. A light on the water. The seasons turned. Summer's heat softened into the rustle of fall leaves. The lake shimmered in copper and gold, ducks gliding where Rebecca's barrier had once choked the water. My cabin smelled of wood smoke again, of boots drying by the fire, of peace I hadn't thought possible just months before. On the surface, the war was over. The drones gone. The lights dismantled. The board reorganized. But every time I raked leaves by the shoreline or stacked wood for the stove, I felt it, that lingering awareness that shadows don't disappear, they just shift. One evening, just before the first frost, I walked down to the dock with a thermos of coffee. The boards creaked under my weight, same as they had when Dad and I had fished here years ago. I set the thermos down on the railing and stared across the cove. Her house glowed faintly in the distance, a single light burning in the upstairs window. I wondered if she was watching me, if her mind was still plotting Phase 3, if she still saw this lake as hers to command. But then I heard it, laughter. Children's laughter, echoing from the neighbor's yard where kids chased each other with flashlights. The sound carried clear and honest across the water. And suddenly, her light didn't matter. Because the truth was simple. One woman's shadow could never outshine a community's laughter. It took me a while to accept it, to believe that victory didn't look like Rebecca packing up her things and leaving. It didn't look like handcuffs or courtrooms. Victory was quieter. It was people showing up for a potluck. It was Hank knocking on my door again with a thermos in hand. It was Mrs. Henderson sitting on her porch knitting while the grandkids played by the water without fear of red lights in their windows. That was the win. But Rebecca wasn't gone. She'd show up at board meetings, quieter now, cautious, her confidence cracked but not shattered. I'd catch her eyes on me sometimes, cold as November rain. She never apologized, never admitted wrong. And maybe that was the hardest truth to swallow. Not every villain gets an ending that satisfies. Some just fade into the background, waiting for their chance. One night I was stacking logs by the shed when Hank walked up. He didn't say anything at first, just picked up a log and started helping. After a while, he wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at me. "You did good," he said. I shrugged, felt like I almost lost everything. He gave me a look, that old, steady look that made me feel 12 years old again, back when Dad was teaching me how to tie a line. Sometimes holding on looks like losing until the dust settles. You stood your ground. That's what matters. I nodded, not trusting my voice, because deep down I knew he was right. Later that night after Hank left, I sat on the porch steps with my father's old bolt cutters across my lap. The same ones I'd used to snap Rebecca's barrier loose. They were rusted now, worn from years in the shed, but they had weight. History. And I realized something. Those cutters weren't a weapon. They were a reminder. That when the moment comes, when someone tries to chain you down, sometimes the only thing you can do is cut yourself free. The cabin creaked behind me, the smell of wood smoke curling into the air. I thought about Dad, about how proud he'd be to see the community beginning to heal. And I thought about Rebecca, about the way she'd underestimated all of us. Because this wasn't her lake, it never was. It belonged to everyone who'd ever cast a line off these docks, who'd ever watched the sun set over the pines, who'd ever taught a child to swim in its waters. It belonged to those who protected it not with lies and forged papers, but with honesty, patience, and care. And maybe that was the lesson all along. That power built on fear collapses, but community, once awakened, endures. I took a deep breath of the cold autumn air, listening to the silence of the lake. For the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel like waiting for the next attack. It felt like peace. And as the last light faded from Rebecca's window across the cove, I whispered to myself words I'd heard my father say more times than I could count. Land, not just something you own, it's something you honor. The cabin groaned, the lake shimmered, and somewhere in the distance, laughter carried again. And I knew this fight hadn't broken me. It had rooted me. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.